I've been asked to introduce this fine gentleman as the gobshite with the webshite. And also the all singing and all dancing logical fallacy, bracket, hairless faculty, close bracket. I think that's probably enough, but over to you, Tony. You're going to talk about logical fallacies.
I am. I'm going to talk about three things. So I have no idea how long this is going to last. Haven't timed it.
Well,
I've never done this before. I realise that. I've never done this before, so I'm completely making it up as I go along. I have to say, I am not an expert. I have to say that up front. And in actual fact, I would suggest that you should never take anyone's word for it. That's the first thing to say. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about what philosophy is and what it isn't, because the way that philosophy is treated out in the public out there in the wide world is that it answers the questions that science can't answer, or that it poses, it deals with the difficult questions. It doesn't. Here's what philosophy does. It teaches us how to ask the right question. That's it. That's all it does. If somebody's getting conclusions out of philosophy, it's not philosophy they're doing, it's extracting from sphincters and places like that. So, that's really the remit of philosophy. It teaches us to analyse questions and to make sure that we're asking the right kind of questions. Now, just today, I had to modify this because I came across a perfect example. So here's a question. This popped up on my timeline on Facebook earlier today. Why is Narcan free to a dope addict, but my insulin is $750 a month? Seems a perfectly reasonable question, doesn't it? Here's what philosophy does with that question. Because that's the better question, isn't it? Yeah? So that's what philosophy is really for. So the central question of philosophy is, have I identified my presuppositions and have I made sure that none of them fail? That's really what we're all about. So, we spend a lot of time, a lot of people who've done formal study of philosophy will find that you will find that they know an awful lot of things about what people have said. That is not doing philosophy. Collecting ISBN numbers is not philosophy. So we do talk a lot about the things of the past, and of course the Whitehead quote was a perfect example of that. Plato was one of the great thinkers, as was Aristotle. Everybody talks about Aristotle. You've all heard causal arguments for God and cosmological argument, all of these first cause arguments. What they are is appeals to a notion of causality that has been far superseded by science. But people hold it up there like it's the truth. We talk about protecting causality and how every effect must have a cause. What they don't tell you is that not all events are effects. So there are events for which there is no cause, and I mean absolutely no cause. We know from Bell's theorem, a famous Irish physicist called John Bell, came up with a theorem which could show if there were any hidden variables in our experiments with quantum mechanics. And he showed categorically that because they violate certain equalities that have to hold true, that are just logic and numbers, that these arguments have to hold true, and yet quantum mechanics violates them, that there are no hidden variables. So these are the things we know. But we talk about the thinkers of the past, not because they were right, but because of what they taught us about how to think. So when we're looking through the words of Aristotle, for example, we're reading Aristotle, what we should be looking at is, how is he reasoning? Not what is he saying and how should we be taking this as true? How is he thinking, and what can we learn from it? So there's one great example. Aristotle famously reasoned that women have fewer teeth than men. And he would not be swayed from this. Now, all of us here know, as good seasoned skeptics, that all you need to do is to take a selection of men and women at random and count. But this was beneath Aristotle because he was a thinker, and measuring was the work of artisans, and he wouldn't be swayed from his position. So that's an important lesson, is we don't think of Aristotle because he was right, because he was often so wrong it's not true. But he did teach us a lot about how to think. So, most people think they have a pretty good understanding of logic. I do. I know I'm no expert. I know I make mistakes all the time. Does anybody watch quiz shows on TV? Yeah? Okay. So you've all seen something like The Chase, where a question comes up about fruit flies, and the contestant goes, oh, you know, my uncle's an entomologist, so I should know all about the mating habits of fruit flies. That's what passes for logic out there on the street. It really is. It's scary. So, in technical parlance, logic is the study of argument form. So, what that means is it deals with, is the structure of an argument good? That's what we deal with. So, let's start with the types of reasoning, because before we can really get into fallacies, we have to get into where the remit of a fallacy is, because they don't always apply, and it becomes important later on. So, at the top we have deduction. So this is the thing that Sherlock Holmes was famous for. Can anybody spot the deliberate mistake? No? What Sherlock Holmes did was this, not this. Sherlock Holmes never did an ounce of deduction in his entire written career. This is what he did. So, in the deductive argument, if the premises are true and the reasoning is valid, i.e. the route from premises to conclusion follows logically, then the conclusion is necessarily true. And this is what we mean by proof. This is what a proof is. So, if your premises are true and your route is valid, you have proved your argument. Your conclusion cannot possibly be false. Okay? In induction, if your premises are true and the route is valid, conclusion is strongly supported. Now, you'll often hear about the distinction between deduction and induction as deduction reasoning from the general to the specific, and induction reasoning from the specific to the general. But it's not true. It's a good rule of thumb, but you will find counter-examples of both. So this is a better way of saying it. If your premises are true, and the route to the premises to the conclusion is valid, then we can have good confidence. That's really what we're saying. We can have good confidence that the conclusion is true. Abductive reasoning is a kind of a heuristic reasoning. So a heuristic is a tool of learning. So we look at using various methods of reasoning, the most important being parsimony, or as you might know it, Occam's razor. We can say, infer this hypothesis from this observation. So we might say, drop a pencil. We can infer the hypothesis that there's a force pulling down on the pencil when I let go of it. That's all that is, okay? So the most important thing about abduction is parsimony. You'll have seen lots of statements of Occam's razor. Can anybody cite it? Occam's razor. Can anybody recite it?
The simplest explanation is...
That's exactly the recitation I was looking for, and it's wrong. And here's why. Because simplicity is it's really a matter of complexity rather than... So simplicity and complexity don't reside on the same spectrum. You take a hinged pendulum, for example. It's got two moving parts, yet the movement is complex, its behaviour is complex. And that's really what complex means. It means it's composed of parts. So, in Occam's razor, what we actually say is you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. That means that for competing hypotheses, and I'll come to what competing hypotheses are in a minute. For competing hypotheses are the one with the fewest entities in it is the one that should be tested first. So it's not really, we don't prove anything by Occam's razor. All we do is we trim things out so that we can find the most efficient way of going through the tests. That's really all that is. For a competing hypothesis, let's say, take for example, hypothesis A. The automobile works by a series of gears, combustion engine, drive shaft, tyres, delivering friction to the road, giving motive power. Hypothesis B is exactly the same, but we also have a group of pixies pushing from behind. Yeah? This is what we mean by competing hypotheses. So we test the one without the pixies first, and we don't bring the pixies in until we need them. Yeah? This is the thing that people do with God. We have a valid scientific explanation for this over here that matches all observation, and then we have the same explanation over here but with God added. That's how Occam's razor works in that situation. So, there is a... Let me think. Okay, so there's a common argument that science doesn't deal in facts, that there's no proof in science. So this is one of my pet peeves. We do have proof in science, which we'll come to shortly. So here's a modern statement of what are called the classical laws of thought. Okay? No proposition can simultaneously be both true and false. Sounds reasonable, yeah? Nothing can simultaneously be both what it is and not what it is. Now that doesn't mean that it can't be what it is and not something else as well. For instance, this pen is a paperweight. Yeah? Something can be multiple things at once, it just can't be not what it is. So, for any proposition, either that proposition is true or its negation is true. What do we think? They sound reasonable. Are they true?
Well, these are suppositions, aren't they, of logic?
That's a good thing, exactly. They're pragmatic. So, as long as they continue to work, we'll continue to use them. We know lots of situations where they're not true, where they simply don't apply, where they're the wrong kinds of question. Yeah, there are things called explosive logics. There are intuitionist logic. I'm not a logician. This is up there, you know, triple doctorate in maths and logic territory, which I don't have. I have a great through trumpet though. So what they really are, they're like laws of physics. They're like physical laws. They're descriptions. That's all they are. They're not prescriptive, they're descriptions. So these are descriptions of how we think about binaries, how we think about things that are directly in contradiction with each other. And they're basically all statements of the same principle in essence. You know, it is what it is, and it's not what it is. Yeah? So, one of the things we have to be careful about, though, is whether we've actually identified a true binary. What do we think? True or false?
True.
We all recognise this, I take it, yes? Yes? This is Pythagoras' theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Yeah, so true or false?
True.
True. Okay. There you go, there's a triangle with three right angles.
It's only true on a plane.
It's true in Euclidean geometry, yes, in non-Euclidean geometry, in spherical geometry especially, or in hyperbolic geometry, forget it. I'm not even sure if the site even reading hyperbolic geometry, but I'm not honest. But this is clearly a right angled triangle, because all three angles are right, and every side is the hypotenuse.
It's not a right angle triangle.
It is.
It isn't, because the angle at the bottom is not the same as the angle.
Yeah, no, that's just the limitations of my ability to draw a triangle on the surface of a sphere. That's not but if you were to go 90 degrees, if you were to go out 90 degrees, and it's simply a matter of choosing a 90-degree angle at the pole, walk to the equator 90 degrees apart, and then come back and meet at the equator, you have a triangle with three right angles and three hypotenuses. So that's just a little caveat. We need to be sure we've identified a true contradictory, because this doesn't completely falsify Pythagoras. All it says is that in Euclidean geometry, the square and the hypotenuse of a right angle triangle, etc. In non-Euclidean geometry, it's not true. So there's a counter. This is where we get into sort of areas of fuzziness. I'll talk a little bit about fuzzy logic, I think I covered it. So, minding your P's and Q's. Yeah, let me just keep up with my notes. So, this is about syllogisms and formal logic. I'm sure you've all watched debates on the internet, Matt Dillahunty eviscerating somebody,
I think many of us have.
Or Christopher Hitchens raking an apologist over the calls. A line into a den of Daniels, as he called it. Yeah. So, this is about formal logic. So, formal logic is a logic where the structure of the argument matters. Okay? Now, what we can do, it's worth noting that only charlatans, religious apologists, and people who teach this actually use syllogisms. If somebody comes across to you and starts presenting a syllogism in a debate, you know they're trying to flim-flam.
So what, define a syllogism?
So a syllogism is basically, so this is the logical notation form of a syllogism. Okay. So this is called modus ponens, and it stands for affirming the antecedent. So we've got two propositions here. We've got the antecedent proposition P. We've got the consequent proposition Q. Here we have a statement that observation tells us that P is correct. Therefore, 3 dots, Q. So, for example, going back to the philosophy classes, lots and lots of chestnuts talking about Socrates. So here's one. This is an argument that fills this is, for example, premise 1. All men are mortal, right? So we've got man implies mortal, yes? Socrates was a man. This is a specific instance of P. Therefore, Socrates was mortal, yeah? So, two premises. First premise, second premise, conclusion, yeah? And it's very simple. You can see if P implies Q, and we get P, then Q must be true. Okay? So, this is a valid argument. If you find an argument like this, you can say it's valid. That doesn't mean that there are no problems with it or that no fallacies have been committed, just that the fallacies aren't fallacies of form, hence formal fallacies. So, this is another validating form. This is the form that we use when we do proof in science. So you'll all have heard of falsification, yes? This is falsification in a nutshell. So, hypothesis infers this observation. We don't observe this, therefore the hypothesis is incorrect. Yeah? That's simple as that. So, to use the same argument, man implies mortal. Mount Everest isn't mortal. Therefore, Mount Everest isn't a man. Yeah? Okay? So it's exactly the same. I'm trying to use the same sort of forms as I go. Okay, I'll just show you this one. This is actually exactly the same form, because all we've done is swap the knots there. But this proposition can be a negating proposition, so it's really just a matter of interest there. So we could say here, all men are mortal. Oh, here we go. Mountains are not mortal. Oh, right, mortals are not mountains. Mount Everest is a mountain, therefore Mount Everest is not mortal. Okay. Okay, so here's a couple of formal fallacies. I'm just going to focus on the two biggies because almost every fallacy that ever gets committed in discourse can be reduced to one of these two fallacies one way or another. Almost all of them are this one. This is presuppositionalism. This is the whole of presuppositionalism here. So what we're saying here is that Q implies Q, Q, therefore P. And can anybody see what the problem is with that?
Yes.
Okay, so if I was to say...
it doesn't say that all of them are, or that that's the only one, so P could equal S as well.
If where S is a proposition, where S is a premise in an argument, yes.
Or something else could equal Q.
Yeah.
Something else could equal Q, exactly,
Yeah.
that's entirely the point. So what we're saying is that that might not be the only thing that implies Q. So, I was sure I had one here for this, but if I were to say, all men are mortal, Socrates was mortal, therefore Socrates was a man. That sounds fine, right, until I tell you that Socrates is the name of my next door neighbour's cat. You might not be the only Socrates. Yeah? I lied about that.
Oh, yeah.
I lied about that. Next door neighbour's cat's actually called Heidegger.
Is there any discussion to be had over the word mortal?
Yes, I mean,
So you mentioned about mountains not being more.
Yeah. Well, they don't live, so they can't die.
Right, okay. But they can disappear, of course. They can be
But they don't have
way eroded.
But mortality is. I'm defining mortality for the sake of this.
Okay.
For the sake of this, I'm defining mortality as having life. Yeah. Okay.
How do you define life?
Well, then we have an answer.
There's absolutely that is one of the most profoundly interesting questions in science.
Yeah.
Lots of people have tried to answer it,
Yeah.
and no matter what we do, we end up in our definition either excluding things that we think of as alive, or including things we think of as not alive. So viruses, for example, in the current parlance, are not living. They're essentially strands of DNA. That's really all they are. However, you know, there are all sorts of problems coming into that, and it's kind of a bit beyond the scope for this. It's a great question, though, and I haven't got a satisfactory answer to that. Lots of good ones, you know, about use of resources and being self-replicating, but whatever we try to include, we're going to include something
Locally contradicts the second law of thermodynamics.
Well, it doesn't. Nothing contradicts the second law of thermodynamics.
Well, locally it does.
No, it doesn't. Come back to me during the Q&A and I'll explain why. Okay, I'll explain why. Life is actually a manifestation of entropy in action. It is the second law of thermodynamics in action. Yeah? What's happening is that, no, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it in the Q&A, because otherwise I'll be here all night, and you really don't want that, because I can talk. So this is denying the antecedent. So P implies Q, not P, therefore not Q. So there's easiest way to deal with this is I had an example in my head and I'm not putting it on my notes.
It's just the reverse of the previous, right?
Okay, all men are mortal. Socrates is not a man, therefore Socrates is not mortal. Socrates is still my next door neighbour's cat and completely mortal. So that's what that is. So you can see that what we've got here, so this is actually identical in form to something called commutation conditional. So there's when we start dealing with if-then statements, these are really all we're doing. It's exactly the same logic, but the fallacies are given different names. So that's denying the antecedent. So those are fallacies of form. Those are fallacies where the structure of the argument matters. And there is lots and lots and lots of information. That notation is huge. But to be honest, you can get past most of the beginning of it and get to a point where you can grasp it just with what I've given you there. So the arrow for implies, the 3 dots for therefore, and the not or the tilde you'll sometimes see in the notation. But the notation is less important for our purposes than just being able to identify the fallacies. So you can have a valid argument that is founded on complete nonsense, as long as the reasoning is valid, as long as your argument follows the proper order. You haven't committed a formal fallacy, but you might have committed informal fallacies. So there's an important distinction to be drawn between validity and soundness. So a sound argument is an argument with true premises and valid logic, a valid argument. So your premises are true, your argument is valid, your conclusion is true. You can put anything in the place of a premise. How many have heard the cosmological argument? Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, for its first premise. Does it?
No.
Okay. Well, we do. It's recent knowledge, and I'm not sure it's disseminated, and I spend a lot of time in theoretical physics boards and things like that. But actually, since 2017, the back end of in December, the last observation of a loophole-free Bell inequality was observed, and that tells us that those events have no cause. We can categorically say that the notion of cause is nonsense at the quantum level. And quantum mechanics is reality, don't ever let anybody tell you differently. So a fallacy of relevance is any argument that relies on something that goes beyond the scope of the form. So here are some common fallacies of relevance. So we'll start with these are all instances of the genetic fallacy. So a genetic fallacy is when an argument is accepted or dismissed based only on the source of the argument. So for example, if I were to say the Kalam cosmological argument is nonsense because William Lane Craig's an idiot, yeah? That would strictly be an ad hominem, so I'm not actually addressing
Even though it might be true.
Well, it is true. It is true. Both my propositions were in fact true statements. But yeah, so the appeal to authority, a lot of people don't realise this, but that's actually an ad hominem. It's an argument to the man, it's an appeal to the source of the argument. So these are all poisoning the well is setting up a situation whereby you can commit an ad hominem or a genetic fallacy. So it's like saying, oh, well, you're friends with that Hillary Clinton, so we can dismiss anything you have to say. Yeah? Or you know, Charles Darwin routinely ate babies. If he did, we don't know. If he did, it won't make any difference to whether evolution is true. Yeah? Okay? Appeal to motivation. This is the big one. Has anyone been accused of virtue signalling? Yeah, so this is one of the current hot button fallacies on the internet at the moment. When somebody says something about, so for example, I was accused of virtue signalling. I wrote a piece about the children who were being caged in the US, separated from their parents by immigration services. And it's all, oh, you're just one of them Hillary, you're just virtue signalling, you're saying that just so that you look good. So that's actually an appeal to motivation and poisoning the well. So you'll see these are all, what about us? Butter emails, yeah, and guilt by association again. So I want to look at the appeal to authority for a second. So here's an argument, what do we think? Richard Dawkins says the universe came from nothing. Richard Dawkins is a respected scientist, therefore the universe came from nothing. What do we think?
That's not quite.
Yes.
Doesn't follow.
Yes, we wouldn't believe that.
Okay.
What is that?
Is there anything specific about it? Is there anything specific about it? It is an appeal to authority,
Yeah.
but what's wrong with it as an appeal to authority?
There isn't a link between the two statements.
Yeah, well, I mean, apart from his health, Richard Dawkins isn't a cosmologist, is he?
No, exactly.
He's an ethologist, he studies animal behaviour.
Can I ask?
He never said this, by the way. We just thought I'd point that out. Okay, let's try this one. Lawrence Krauss says the universe came from nothing. Lawrence Krauss is a respected cosmologist, therefore the universe came from nothing. What do we think?
Still not good.
Yeah.
It's still an appeal for an authority, but it's more reasonable in this case because he is the responsible.
He's going to be right more times than he's wrong when compared. When compared. He never said this, by the way.
Sorry?
He never said this, by the way. Lawrence Krauss has never said the universe came from nothing.
So,
No. Yes, you're right. He didn't. He said.
What he said is that the laws of quantum mechanics allow it to occur.
Well, he wrote a book which said a universe from nothing.
Yes.
Did he write that?
Yes. But he didn't actually say that the universe came from nothing.
No, he didn't.
I actually did.
Possibility that it might have come.
I actually wrote
There
it.
might be no nothing.
When you all go searching for my blog when we finished it, you will find a piece called "The Certainty of Uncertainty," and it is essentially a review of that book. So it's about what the book actually said versus
What's your blog?
it will be on the screen at the end.
sorry, so you argue something is fallacious when we state that it is 100% true, but is it correct or incorrect to say, therefore it's likely that it may be so based on authority?
Well, so this comes back to different kinds of reasoning. So we can say inductively that we can have some confidence, and that's really what Guy was talking about. So because this is a respected cosmologist, As if we take this as an inductive argument rather than a deductive one, we can say the conclusion that the universe came from nothing is a conclusion we can have some confidence in.
But you may find another cosmologist who doesn't say that.
Well, exactly.
It says the opposite.
So he only says it, it's not
Okay.
a true premise.
You'll like this.
Dun, 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 dun.
Scientific consensus says the universe came from nothing. Scientific consensus is a valid authority, therefore the universe came from nothing. Okay?
Yeah.
Does that fulfill that premise?
No.
What do we think?
We're not sure. I'm not sure that P1 is correct.
You're not sure that P1 is correct? It isn't. It's not a true statement.
No.
It's not a true statement. I'm just cycling through the levels of potential authority.
Yeah.
Scientific consensus says the universe came from nothing.
It's
It doesn't.
It's still an appeal to authority.
No universes were claimed to have come from nothing at any point in this presentation, regardless of who said No animals were harmed in the sending of this message, but millions of electrons were horribly inconvenienced.
There are some questions of fact, for instance, historically, that only witnesses can say, or could attest to. So our knowledge of certain things depends on witness statements and records.
Eyewitness testimony is entirely useless.
Yeah,
I'll come to some of the reasons
As a
for
matter
that.
of-
Eyewitness testimony has absolutely no place in epistemology. We know nothing from somebody's claim to have seen something other than that they claim to have seen something. That is the most knowledge we can actually take away.
But that's just some level of reasoning. However, if you apply this reasoning everywhere, then judicial system wouldn't function.
Well, the
history wouldn't work.
judicial system has an extremely poor standard of evidence, and in actual fact, where it really matters, eyewitness testimony on its own will never ever be taken.
Why do you say poor? It's not high. It's not sort of in civil cases. Just probability is 51%.
Yeah.
So,
But if you take, I mean, it has to be said that where we're talking about statistics and probabilities, there is fuzziness. So we are talking about fallacies of the sort that apply to binary statements and that sort of thing. The evidential standard in a court of law is shockingly bad, which is how we get so many people on death row who were vilified, not vilified. The opposite, vindicated, that's the one.
how many people, percentage-wise?
Well, there's a very good friend of mine called, who spends the time on the internet, Godless Mom, who is deeply involved in something called the Innocence Project. And it's shocking how many people actually are wrongly convicted and DNA evidence later exonerates them.
That's in the US, yeah?
That's in the US. And I always say, I have two words for anybody who says that we should bring back the death penalty here. I'm not sure actually, I'm not sure if treason to the crown is still a capital offence. I know it was until not very long ago.
It was
It's not
about
capital offence at all.
15, 20 years ago.
Right, I know it can't have been that
It
long
was
ago.
out in the New Majesty's Dockyard and high treason,
Yeah,
and they removed it.
yeah. Because I know that the judge in Jerry Conlon's trial said, I wish I could have charged him with treason to the crown so we could execute you.
So, may I ask your opinion regarding history? What happened like 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? What do you think?
We can.
How can we?
Can
is
we?
it just irrelevant?
Let's do that later.
Can we save it for the Q&A?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're doing, well, these are good questions though. So, what have we got? We've got scientific consensus. So inductively we can have better confidence than previously because this is more than one cosmologist saying this is what our models suggest, this is what the data tells us. So, how about this? What do we think? This is the only valid authority. No person, nothing anyone says is a valid authority. And still,
Except.
we can only have a degree of confidence.
It's inevitably an interpretation of the data, even so, isn't it?
Well,
Data will never be complete.
okay, so this is true, and actually there's I'm going to come back. I'm going to talk about the logic in science and peer review in a bit, and I'll come back to that because that touches on that sort of area. But yes, the data is the only valid authority. there are going to be interpretational issues, but there are ways around them, and we'll come to that.
And also, data is only the data you have at the moment.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Probably
Well,
of that.
of course, but if data come in and contradict it, that statement changes because the data is the thing.
Yeah.
Data are a thing in flux. Sorry.
The proper way to phrase that is that the data implies the universe came from nothing, therefore the universe probably
Okay.
came from nothing.
Yeah, and that's because we're treating that as an absolute statement.
Yeah.
And this is where we come. So conclusions in science are always tentative. So when we say science doesn't do proof, that's really what we're talking about. We're saying that the conclusions aren't proven to be true. But we still do use proof in science because we use different kinds of reasoning. So here's another few. These are a few other obvious fallacies of relevance. Appeal to consequence and slippery slope. We've all heard that. Well, you know, if we let them in, they're going to bring in all these. We're going to bring all these into this list, and once we open the borders, we never know what we'll get and all that crap. That's the failure of logic there. But none of these are relevant to whether, for example, as humanists, we think that we should be more concerned with making sure that everybody's okay and worry about the possible consequences later on. But we have to be careful. So a red herring. That's the look over there fallacy. Bait and switch is where you set up. So there's actually a bait and switch is a legal term. So you might get in an advert, you might get somebody who says 9 true things, and then one thing that's complete nonsense. And the whole point is that you've built up trust by saying these 9 true things that they can agree are true. Then you switch to something at the end, and that's where you're selling them something, yeah? So the bait and switch fallacy is the same thing. So the Gish Gallopers do this a lot. So if you haven't heard of a Gish Galloper is named after Dwayne Gish of the Creation Museum. And Gish Galloping is basically presenting reams and reams and reams of arguments so that your opponent in debate hasn't got time to debunk them all. But William Lane Craig is par excellence at this. He manages to cram a lot in 5 arguments in 15 minutes. They're all complete nonsense, but fallacy of equivocation is where you switch meanings partway through your argument. So again, the Kalam cosmological argument does this in a sense because it's switching between 2 very, very different meanings of beginning to exist. So we've got in the first premise, he's talking about things that exist within the universe. He even says it's intuitively true. You know, appeal to intuition was somewhere else. It's intuitively true, so that's an appeal to intuition, that's a fallacy. But he's talking about things within the universe, and all of these things are creation ex materia, i.e. from stuff that already exists. Then, in his second premise, the universe began to exist. He says from nothing. Actually, I've just realised I lied. William Lane Craig says the universe came from nothing. He makes that claim. We don't agree with him. I've lost my thread. Fallacy and equivocation, yes. So, in the second premise, he's talking about beginning to exist from nothing. This is a completely different proposition. In one, we're talking about stuff changing form, essentially. And in another, we're talking about literal generation from nothing.
You mean by God, ex nihilo?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. The gambler's fallacy. How many of you play the lottery? No? No, I win £2 every week. Same as all of you. So the gambler's fallacy, but lots of people who play the lottery do this all the time. They get the same numbers every week after week after week after week after week, on the basis that the more they do it, the more probable it is at this time. When in actual fact the probability of any outcome is the same every single time. It's all about the probabilistic resources. Your odds of winning are only about the number of people competing at any one time versus the number of tickets drawn. Okay. Okay. What do we think of this one? This is the fallacy's fallacy. Okay. Okay.
What's to discuss?
So, this commits so many fallacies, it's not true. But what about the conclusion?
Yeah, that's true.
Right, so this is a warning, right? There's something called the fallacies fallacy, and that's where we dismiss a conclusion based on the fact that a fallacy was committed in the presentation of the argument. In fact, what it is a warning is not to dismiss conclusions. We don't dismiss conclusions, we only dismiss arguments as not having supported their conclusion. Yeah? So that's what we're rejecting. We're not rejecting the notion that diamond is an elemental form carbon, because that would just be silly. Okay? On a related note, I made sure to make a note of this. On a related note, it's really, really common. You see this on, if you spend any time on the internet watching debates, debate boards, you'll see somebody just drop the name of a fallacy and run away. You know, that's circular reasoning. Yeah? As if that's made the case for them.
Yes.
And that is just such a pernicious practice that I actually always say, if you can't own an argument, don't make it. You know, if you're not going to expose what the fallacy is by showing how this logic is operated in your argument and exposing the fallacy as it's committed, then you better leave it alone. Okay. Here's a big one. Circular reasoning, or petitio principii, or begging the question. So this is an accusation that gets slung around like a teenager who's just discovered his right hand door, you know. So
Jehovah's Witnesses do it all the time.
yes. Yeah, well, the prime example of circular reasoning is the Bible is the Word of God.
Therefore,
it says so in the Bible. The Bible is the Word of God, it says so in the Bible. So, it's worth noting, I've seen this get thrown around a lot, and I see a lot of people getting jumped on for a technicality in it. So, all circular reasoning is begging the question, but not all begging the question is circular reasoning. So, for example, petitio principii just means appeal to principle. So basically it means appealing to a premise. So, here's an example. Now, at first glance, it actually looks okay, that doesn't it? It looks valid.
Okay. It's false.
Yeah. So, it looks fine, it's clearly valid, and it's worth noting that circular arguments are always valid, and if the premises are true, the conclusion is always necessarily true. So, a circular argument can still be a valid and sound one, and still be fallacious. Because if you think about it, what we're saying here is that the conclusion appears in the premise. Well, if the premises are true, and the conclusion appears in the premise, then the premise must be true, it can't not be true. Yeah. But the real problem with this, so what we really need to do to look at it, this is a loaded term, okay? So let's get rid of that. And really we're just asserting that abortion is murder. Whether it is or not, that's not really for this discussion, but let's strip out that loaded term. This is exactly the same argument. There is no difference in the content of the argument. We're not saying any more or less than we were saying in the previous form, but now you can actually see that it's just assertion and assertion. And I had meant to say, ipsa dixit is the fallacy of bare assertion. Circular reasoning basically reduces to this. The problem with the circular argument is not that we haven't supported the argument with the argument. We have supported the argument because the conclusion's in the premises, and we know that if the premises are true. The problem is that we've just reduced it to the statement that abortion is morally wrong. Okay? Worth noting that an example of a begged question that isn't circular reasoning, i.e. where the premise isn't contained, is, for example, if the premise relies on something else being true. So, we think of a way to cast that. So, God is the fount of all wisdom, taking that as a premise for an argument. It begs the question whether actually God exists. Yeah. So there is a question there that's not stated in the premise, but the question is still part of the premise because it's a. So that's what we talk about. Have we identified our presuppositions and made sure that they haven't failed? So this is what this is. Okay, so this is a favourite of mine. Argumentum ad lexicum.
May I just clarify? So
Yes.
we're discussing the soundness of arguments, not their validity.
So we're talking about soundness and validity. So a circular argument, if the premise is true, is both sound and valid.
Yeah, but it's both sound and valid in circular reasoning.
Yes. Yes, because if the premise is if the conclusion is the premise and the premise is true, then the conclusion is true.
Yeah.
So it's sound and it's valid as long as it follows the logical structure.
Yeah. So what's wrong then with this?
Well, we haven't demonstrated that it's sound. We don't know that the premise was true in the first place.
Correct. So
Because the proof that we have for the premise for the conclusion being true is that the premise is true. So all we're doing is going round and round and asserting the same thing. That's why it reduces to ipse dixit. It reduces to the fallacy of bare assertion. So a circular argument doesn't do anything. It just makes a statement.
yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm just trying to understand the difference between soundness and validity.
So soundness is
It's essentially the content.
Validity. Yes. So yes.
of the
Yes.
argument.
But soundness also includes validity.
Yeah. Okay.
So a sound argument must be valid to be sound, and the premises must be true. So soundness is about the content of the argument.
Yeah. Validity is the formal sequence.
And exactly right. Yes. Yeah. So this is I invented this one. That's a good accusation you get a lot of. Somebody came up to me once, went and said, "Argumentum ad lexicum is not a recognised fallacy." Okay. So I made that name up. Can anybody guess what it is, or work out what it is?
Argument from mixed words.
It's appeal to the dictionary.
Yeah.
So it's when somebody says, "Oh, the Oxford English Dictionary says that an atheist is somebody who believes that God doesn't exist." Okay, so dictionaries are like physical laws. Yeah, they're descriptions of usage. They're not authorities on what words mean. They describe usage. They describe how words are popularly used, and that is a very, very much moving feast. So if your argument hinges on the fact that the Oxford English Dictionary defines one of your terms a certain way, then your argument's already failed. The reason that I give it this because it actually commits two fallacies in one. The first is the appeal to authority, because it's citing the dictionary as an authoritative source. And secondly, it's the appeal to popularity, because dictionaries only tell you about popular usage.
And they usually only tell you about what the popular usage was 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years ago.
Exactly, because there's a massive amount of inertia in inclusion in the dictionary, because we'll use words for a couple of years and then they'll fall into disuse. You know, memes essentially in sensu Dawkins, the way he originally coined the term, we have these ideas, phrases and words and portmanteau and all of these wonderful things, and they change all the time. And dictionaries are basically a snapshot of what usage was at some point, probably 5 or 6 years ago. Their rules of inclusion have to include things going to print. A lot of that's changing, of course, with the dawn of the internet. I'm not sure how sort of things are moving along with that. But the argument, it's just semantics, is one of the most misused. And the reason is that semantics is important. But semantics isn't arguing about what a word means. Semantics is making sure at the outset that you understand what I mean when I use a term, and I understand what you mean when you use a term, and if possible, some discussion that allows us to come to a clarified understanding that both of us accept this is the word, this is the meaning we're going to use. And then you're done, and you can move on to the actual argument. So that's what this is a cry of, but most of the time, I've lost count. I mean, I have to say, hold my hands up and say I've gotten involved as well in arguments about what the word atheist means. And I've done a full exposition on the blog as well about why I use it the way I use it. I use it to mean somebody who, I use it as a privative essentially. It's a description of the absence of something.
Yeah.
I don't believe in God.
I think
That's it.
No, that's the way we mostly use it.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty universal among those who would describe themselves as atheists. And of course, there are the so-called strong or hard atheists who are still atheists, but they have an additional, they're not believing, that they actually believe in God that doesn't exist is an additional argument, it's an additional thing. So, yeah, so if you're spending time arguing about what a word means, you're doing it wrong. You're missing the really good stuff, because the really good stuff is just beyond the way you start getting into cases and talking about what stuff really means. So I say, this is what I mean, you tell me what you mean. And if we're really clever and intelligent and careful, we can actually work with two definitions, or we can agree on one so that we can have productive discussion. That's the whole point of semantics, is to further discussion, not to get bogged down. Okay. So these are really common. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc, alternatively just called the post hoc fallacy. After, therefore, because of. So I remember my mum once was having a problem with her computer, and I went up and I sorted it out for her. And the following day she phoned up, she says, you know, ever since you came in, my printer's not working.
Honestly.
Yeah, are you sure it was working before I came? I did look at the printer, we know. So I'm hoping that this display is okay. Because cum hoc, ergo propter hoc, together therefore because of. So these expositions will apply equally. So here we've got one of my wonderful diagrams. This is what I've spent the last 2 weeks doing, by the way, just making these diagrams. Okay, so we've got 3 people, a switch, 186,000 miles. Okay, so we know light travels at a finite speed, 186,000 miles a second. Yeah. So what happens when we flip the switch? Did you see that light up? Can't tell from here.
Yeah.
So you flip the switch, the person on the left, he sees his light come on straight away, and then 1 second later, he sees the other one come on. Yeah? So he's got every right, like this reading, to think that this light coming on caused this light to come on. Yeah? He can't see the switch. Yeah? From the right view, he sees this. He sees his come on first, and then a second later, the left one comes on.
Yes.
Yeah? From the middle, we're going to imagine now that this. You thought he was controlling the switch all along, didn't you? Yeah, no, he isn't. He's just an observer. So, we're going to. This is just a switch that we can see. I want to imagine now that that's a radio controlled switch and you can't see it. Somebody's firing this from elsewhere. So the switch goes on, and then half a second later, both lights come on at the same time. Now he doesn't know about the switch, so he thinks them coming on together caused each other to come on. Yeah? Or that some third event that was co-simultaneous with them was caused by them coming on. So, moving on. How much time have we got? Gosh, that went quickly.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about how logic is used in science.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to romp through this, so we've got time for a few questions. So, this is how logic is actually used in science. You'll see lots and lots of very condensed versions of the scientific process. But they all miss out key steps, and those key steps are what I want to talk about, because there are several accusations that we get in discussion. Firstly, that relying on science is circular. Yeah. So here's why it isn't. Okay? So circular reasoning is a deductive fallacy, which means that it can only apply where deduction is in play. Yeah? So in science, we observe a phenomenon. Yeah? We formulate a hypothesis. So we drop our pencil, and we formulate the hypothesis for the force pulling down on it. We compute the consequences of the hypothesis. So, our hypothesis says that when we let go of the pencil, it will fall down. Okay? So that is a deduction.
You're misusing the Greater Manchester Humanists.
There has been no better use of Greater Manchester Humanists pen. So this portion is deductive, clearly. So we're deducing a set of circumstances that must obtain if our hypothesis is correct. Yes? Something that is necessarily true. predicated on this hypothesis. So that's deduction. We also have to compute a consequence that will falsify our hypothesis. Yeah? So what we have to do is say, if we see this, we're wrong. That hypothesis is dead. Okay? Step 5. We devise an experiment or an observation that will show one or the other, either the validating or the negating. And then we observe the phenomenon. So if 3 is observed, i.e. if we observe the predicted consequences of our hypothesis, then the hypothesis survives. That doesn't mean it's true, it just means it survives. We can inductively have greater confidence in it for each time that happens. If 3 is not observed, it's wrong. You have to throw it out or at least modify it. There may be limiting factors, there may be things like, so for example, Isaac Newton was having his universal law of gravitation validated up the wazoo for about 160 years, and he was wrong. So there may be something that we haven't thought of. And in actual fact, it was known not long after he died that from observations of the perihelion and Mercury that he was wrong, but it was a small error. So if 4 is observed, i.e. the thing that we predicted would definitely not be observed, then the hypothesis is incorrect. So these are all the places where deductive reasoning applies. In those 2 there, and those 2 there, and we can see there's not a hint of an arc in sight. There are no circles to be had there. Okay? And this comes back to what Guy was talking about. It's pragmatic. It works. It keeps working. We keep trying it. It keeps working. And that's why we just have inductively greater and greater confidence every time the results of science, give us results, he said circularly. Has anybody got tautology I can borrow? Okay, I'm going to skip that. And I think I'll give over the rest to questions. Oh, I did want to say one thing about peer review, and this is important. So, when you've done all your hypothesis testing, you've done all your validating and all this stuff, you get to the point where you think you've got everything sorted out, and you write your paper up and you latex it all up and get all your equations together, and you send it off to a journal for publication. What happens then is the journal will send it to a referee, and a referee will be an expert in your own field who will basically attempt to tear it to shreds, trying to find the holes in your paper, trying to find the holes in your logic, anywhere you've committed a fallacy, anywhere where you forgot to carry the 2, that sort of thing, okay? So, once it's published, we can have a degree of confidence that an expert has studied this and found it to be wanting, not found it to be wanting rather. That is actually when peer review really starts. So, people talk about the flaws of peer review, namely, that somebody submitted a load of nonsense papers to journals and got them published, having passed peer review. So there are flaws in peer review, but the broader process of peer review starts at publication. So you think about it like a driving license. When you pass your driving test and put the license in your hand, you think you're the greatest driver in the world, but in actual fact, that's just a license to learn to drive. And that's how we have to think about our scientific hypotheses. Once they've passed pre-publication review, they've got their driving license. And now everybody who's got a vested interest, especially anybody whose work you disagree with, has got a vested interest in absolutely ripping that to shreds. And that's what happens then. So ultimately, the consensus will always lean towards the better and better models. So consensus is something we can have confidence in, but only to the degree that we know that consensus is going to change. But it'll tend to change in the degree of greater accuracy rather than wrongness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. This is such an important area for those of us who, whether we like it or not, end up in debate with theists. But one thing you didn't mention was Bayesian proof.
Yes. Well,
Is that a different?
I thought it a bit beyond the scope, to be honest. Because it's probabilities.
Yeah, but probabilities is also in science.
Yes, well, yes, but dealing with probabilities in an hour and a half on top of this, I thought it would be better for another talk.
So, questions.
Okay, so we had a question about history, didn't we, or was it?
I mean,
well, actually, that Jesus, the existence of Jesus, that's a basic issue.
But why don't we just turn into Jesus, any historical event, maybe 150 years ago, 1,000 years ago, when there was, that just relies on accounts. So we, for instance, our knowledge of a lot of things simply depends upon what historians say.
Yes, that's true. And in actual fact, I have a friend who probably some of you will have heard of called Richard Carrier, who writes a lot about
very famous
theory, and actually I'm just reading one of his at the moment, Scientists in the Early Roman Empire, which is turning out to be really good. Part of the problem we have is, I mean, a lot of it is textual analysis. An awful lot of what I've read in history, and I'm not a historian, I know how to apply the scientific method to history, which is what Carrier does. He deals quite heavily in probability, and especially in Bayes' theorem. And that's really about fuzziness and conclusion. So, for example, we might find something over here that kind of doesn't make sense in terms of this hypothesis, but then over here we've got all of these observations. So we have to kind of gauge. So we pull together all of those probabilities to come out with the final probability. To be honest, it's all a little bit beyond me.
Yeah. I understand. It's not that. But I had another question, if I may.
Yeah.
So, from logical perspective, when you dealt with policies of relevance, one of them was appeal to consequence.
Yes.
So I wonder if, let's say, in the area of ethics, I'm familiar with utilitarianism.
Yes.
So it says an action should be judged whether it's right or wrong based on the consequences it produced. It justifies some actions which lead to good consequences. So, what would your opinion be on that reasoning?
Well, utilitarianism is kind of like pragmatism applied to ethics. It is about what works for society. I think that
so logically it's wrong then?
No, it's not that it's wrong. It's that it can easily lead to we always have to be wary of unforeseen consequences. So we can do something that on balance looks great for society but actually leaves people suffering.
I understand that, but if it's a fallacy, then it's always a fallacy, or if it's not a fallacy, it's not a fallacy.
I wouldn't say it's a fallacy, I just say it's a premise that I disagree with. It's not...
No, I mean, I thought that appeal to consequences is just type of a fallacy.
An appeal to consequences is a fallacy in terms of if we say that that this, so it's a slippery slope essentially, it's the same sort of argument. If we say that we shouldn't let this person into the country because we don't know who we're going to be letting in with them, or we shouldn't allow gay marriage because what's next? Marrying your dog.
You mean consequences in that sense?
Yes.
Because let's say if people say honesty is good because it leads to trust in the society.
Yeah.
Let's say, but that's appeal to consequences as well. Assessment of an action based on consequences, not on its internal nature.
But then that begs the question: is honesty? Is that actually true? Because why do we actually tell the truth? Do we do it to make others feel better, or to make ourselves feel better?
We're just questioning the premise. We're not. But my question is whether it's just kind of blanket mistake to appeal to consequences.
Yeah, it's an error in reasoning. That's not to say that you shouldn't look at a negative consequence and decide that negative consequence is too much for you is too great for you to.
So you would say that action should be judged based on its nature, not on the consequences.
Case by case, yeah, essentially.
So therefore, utilitarianism is erroneous as a matter of logic.
it's not logically erroneous. I just disagree with it. I don't.
In descriptive terms, it may be correct.
Yes.
But in normative terms,
Yes, exactly. But that's what I'm saying is the distinction between descriptive and normative.
exactly.
That's
So
the distinction.
in normative sense, it's invalid. Essentially.
It was going to be questions.
I don't know. I don't know that valid or invalid is something that I would. I don't know that it's something that I'd apply to utilitarianism because it's not a proposition. It's
I think you're losing us.
It's a whole collection of
Can you have that
propositions.
discussion afterwards to continue?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just interested in the tonight between cognitive biases and fallacies. There's some overlap. For example, if you take the bandwagon fallacy,
Yes.
people join in because other people are joining.
Yes.
That's a good argument, isn't it? But there's also in cognitive biases a bandwagon effect, which is a natural human thing to
Absolutely.
go with something that's
Same
very
thing.
sort of got a link there. People falling into a fallacy. Simply by cognitive bias there.
Absolutely. Cognitive biases are the enemy of logic. They really are. They're horrible. There was a very specific example of. I'm trying to remember it. Let me have a think and see if it comes.
Yeah, I think it's another one, but that's the only one I'm trying to think of. The bandwagon effect.
Yeah. But that was it. Yes. So there's a common truism that there's such things as smartest, but the smartest person in the room is smarter than the room. Well, actually, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, suggesting that the opinions of large crowds of people are better than the opinions of individuals. Well, here's the problem with that. Suppose I actually know something about quantum mechanics. I walk into a room, nobody knows anything about quantum mechanics. But I don't know that nobody knows anything about quantum mechanics, and they all have this particular opinion about quantum mechanics. Is it possible that I'm going to be led into their opinion on quantum mechanics as a result of the weight of the populace? The whole in that case is less intelligent than the individual. Yeah, is less smart.
Yeah, with the groups or the
Yes. Yeah. Vox Populi.
I thought there's no argument to get democracy then.
Yes. Anybody got an argument that they really struggle to deal with?
I was interested in one that I had 2 days ago on Facebook with a chap. We were arguing about homosexuality and, the relationship with Parkfield School, if you know the school.
Oh, yeah.
Parkfield, okay. And he asked me at what point and I use his words here, what point was sodomy considered to be valid? So I wrote back to him and I said, yes, I know. I wrote back to him and I said, well, are you implying that it's therefore invalid? And can you tell me if that's so, what you mean by invalid? And he never got back to me.
Yeah, no. Well, sodomy is not a proposition or an argument. So I would say the validity doesn't apply, and neither is it a truth claim. And in actual fact, a lot of the things that you get in response to arguments from religious apologists are challenges of whether truth claims are valid, or whether things that aren't truth claims are true. So we talked about the laws of logic. Are they true? Are they even truth apt? So is atheism true? It's not something to which the concept of truth or untruth applies. It's the privative of something. It's an absence of something. How is it? Unless you mean atheism as the proposition that there is no God.
So that I would call that anti-theism.
I'm saying for me there's a whole issue with labels.
Yeah.
Words.
In the online atheist
Words.
we have this thing about labels. They need to put things in little boxes and classify them. Nature just doesn't work like that.
No, exactly.
I often say it's an exposition. If we had an example of every fossil organism that ever lived, the concept of species would be nonsense.
Yes, absolutely.
It would make absolutely no sense whatsoever.
but we compartmentalise it in order to
That's
learn
snapshots on a spectrum.
And I'm thinking of that words can be obfuscatory at the same time. So, for example, if I'm laying on the floor there dead, clearly dead, okay, it could be said that David is dead and not alive, but when we actually try and find a description for the word life, we fail miserably.
Yeah.
Life's just chemicals constructing until it reacts with its environment.
It's a kind of fuzzy cloud of ideas, really, more than anything else.
We don't really argue that.
I don't think of life as a thing.
No.
It's just a behaviour.
Yes.
We don't talk about the origin of walking.
No.
But it's exactly the same thing. It's a behaviour of matter. That's all it is. Nothing more or less than that. It's how matter behaves.
Yes.
Second law of thermodynamics, don't let me forget that. So, yes, this is one of my... So, the things that I'm most interested in are things like physics, theoretical physics especially. But because many years ago, I joined the Richard Dawkins Forum, which is a massive internet forum attached to Richard Dawkins Foundation's website. Well, it was based here.
Oh, right.
The Richard Dawkins Foundation was here, but he's merged with the Centre for Inquiry. So no, this was back long before then. It actually was wrapped up in 2010.
Okay.
And my interest had always been physics. So I'm a lay philosopher of science, which is what I said. The most accurate description of me is a gobshite with a website. I'm a loudmouth who's done a lot of reading and learned some things. Most of what I've read historically has been physics. So I first read Climbing Mount Improbable. It was the first Richard Dawkins book I came across. And I was completely oblivious to the fact that creationists even existed up until this point. So reading Climbing Mount. So this is a really, really good explanation of how we overcome those probability issues with evolution. But creationists exist. This is still a real thing. And I went on there and started to get involved in the app. And nobody ever wanted to talk about physics. They all wanted to talk about biology. So, of course, I have to go and do all the study of evolution and biology so that I can get involved in those discussions as well. Now, as a result, I ended up coming at biology from the perspective of a physicist. So I'm not a physicist by any means. I'm not an expert in anything except insofar as an X is a has-been and a Spurs a drip under pressure. I am not an expert in anything. I've just read lots of books and talked to lots of people and discussed with scientists. So I started to learn all this, and this common one, the second law of thermodynamics, life is a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Actually, it's not. So think of. So here's energy cascade. Okay, here's the top. This is low entropy. High entropy is down here. What's happening is that literally as the universe is expanding and cooling, the energy is cascading downwards, seeking a point of equilibrium. What happens with life is that due to chemical interactions, a little pocket forms. You can think about it as a waterfall, and a little pocket forms there, where locally it's found a point of entropy that's lower, that's higher than all of this above it. And that's actually what drives complexities. It's the second law of thermodynamics, getting better and better at tying up energy in this higher entropy state. That is actually what drives life. So life doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics. It is the second law of thermodynamics in action. Yeah. So that's really what it's looking at thermodynamics as a drive towards equilibrium, as a cascade downwards towards equilibrium. And finding a plateau there, a little shelf, a little pocket, think of it like a water wheel. You've got a water wheel, and then as all the energy comes down past it, all that matter will be ripped apart and be a sea of photons. The whole universe will be a sea of photons, and then it'll flow the rest of the way down. But what it's actually done is found a local place where it can stabilise in a point where the entropy is lower than this, but still higher than this.
So why can't that act as a form of definition of life?
Because life isn't the only thing that does it.
I can't think of too much else.
Stars.
Sorry?
Stars.
Well, the science fiction authors are actually given stars light.
But stars do this. So part of the problem is that we think of entropy as disorder, because all the popular science books for decades and decades have talked about entropy as disorder. And there's a good reason we talk about it as disorder. It's because Boltzmann, who incidentally described Charles Darwin as the greatest physicist of the 19th century, fun fact. Ludwig Boltzmann, who formulated the laws of thermodynamics, who basically started the S-log equation, he was interested in dynamic systems and dealing with them from a point of statistics. So from the point of view of statistics, this nicely clipped together piece of paper, clump of papers, all nicely ordered, is less probable than strewn around the floor, and actually to get it in that state takes work. So from a statistical perspective, that's a low entropy arrangement. The problem is that when you've got an ordering force increases entropy. And gravity is an ordering force because it draws everything together. Yeah? So gravity is the thing that drives black holes, and black holes are both the densest and the most ordered and the most highly entropic entities in the universe. So an ordering force can generate order while increasing entropy. And that's what we are. So the forces involved in biochemistry are ordering forces that are driving these pockets of lower entropy. Yeah, but stars do that as well under gravity, so we'd have to say that stars are alive. Yeah, and that's exactly the problem.
It's just nature working, isn't it?
Yeah.
Basically, it's just nature working.
Because what we're trying to do is put things in
boxes.
boxes, and nature isn't boxes. Nature doesn't like boxes. We love them. Because and there's a reason for that as well. It's because identifying things and classifying them is evolutionarily useful. When you recognise a pattern of a tiger hiding in the undergrowth, yeah,
or leaking.
It's evolutionarily useful for you to be able to identify it so you can get your legs on. Now it's also important to note that a part of this, on my blog, there's all sorts of stuff about pattern seeking, how we use patterns, it's fascinating stuff. But it also doesn't matter if the pattern that we've seen isn't a tiger in the undergrowth and we run anyway. That's superstition. Think about it. Pareidolia, seeing faces in the clouds, attaching significance to the things we see. All of this is about patterns. And all we're doing is trying to classify patterns and putting them in our little boxes, and we see that one's a face. And of course faces are the first thing we glom onto as babies, because everyone's, everyone's in the cradle, oh, cute, so faces are things that we glom onto the most readily, so we see faces everywhere. And that's all about patterns, and that is a cognitive bias as well, because but it's not just humans that do it. We've seen it in corvids and pigeons even now. There were some famous experiments in the 60s by a guy called B.F. Skinner, who did a lot of experiments with pigeons where if they went round in a circle and then pecked, they'd get a reward.
That's conditioning.
But what he took it well beyond Pavlov, because he was doing things like he had them so that they were still doing it even though the reward wasn't coming, and in some cases even where it was a different behaviour that got the reward, they'd still revert back to the original behaviour that got the reward, because they've identified a pattern and they're behaving superstitiously. And that's how we get to gods. So, any more?
Lots, but
well, what we like to do is to go across to the Waterhouse pub, where we continue more informal discussions. If you're free to do that. If you're very short time, yes. So it's the other side of the town hall, and it's a pub that's we tend to get.
About 50 yards away.
It's not far. Because we have to be out of here. Soon after 9. So we'll call it a day.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Well, thank you.